So hey, welcome to the webinar this afternoon. We're going to be talking about data privacy and identity access management and various topics intertwined within. Appreciate you guys coming on. Of course, we're going to be having a beer tasting as well, which is always fun. So I want to encourage you guys to come off camera as much as you can. If you want to ask questions, please come off of mute, put them in the chat section as well. We want to make this really as dynamic as possible, because at the end of the day, this session is for you guys. It's not for us. So we want to make sure that you guys are heard and we're addressing the right topics and answering the right questions and all that kind of fun stuff. So again, we want to make sure you guys are encouraged to kind of place stuff in the chat or come off mute. If you do try to put on your camera, you will be asked to be admitted as a panelist. Certainly feel free to do so, and that will allow you to, for everybody to kind of see each other and interact with each other, especially during the beer time, right? Because that's the way we see this is we're not here to deliver a ton of information. It's more of all us sitting together around the table, having a beverage of choice, and just interacting with each other. I do want to introduce at first our kind of experts that we have on the panel here. First, we have Matt Graves. Matt is our chief evangelist for what we call CIAM here at CyberRes. Matt, you want to wave real quick? Yeah, perfect. Next, we got Jim Gertkin who's the Director of Identity Services at Novacoast. And then, of course, we've got Richard Cabana as well, who is a solution architect here at CyberRes. Chris, I'm going to hold off on you for just a minute because you're the most important man on the phone call at the moment. So just to kind of kick this off, today we'll be talking about managing customer experiences along with managing access and adherence to data privacy regulations. You know, as customers continue to transform, you know, in this kind of turbulent world we have, you know, top of mind is making sure that we have those frictionless customer experiences in things like increasing our customer loyalty, our brand awareness, as well as, you know, looking at how we monetize those pieces of information. At the same time, what's happening in the market is obviously data protection and data privacy aren't relatively new terms. However, the data privacy governing bodies have really made things a bit challenging here lately, right? And they've led to increased regulation as well as enforcement. And, you know, it's no longer sufficient really just to protect the data, but we need to understand what data we have, you know, how we're protecting it, how we're managing it, and now there's need to talk about the purpose that we're requesting access for that kind of data about. So those are some of the topics we're going to be talking about. Again, please feel free to interact with us. But before we go any further, we want to dive into this, you know, kind of important topic. What I want to do is crack open a cold one with Chris and hear from our resident beer expert, Christopher Quinn, from the Beer Temple. Chris is the owner-operator of the Beer Temple. He's certified Cicerone. Is that pronounced correctly?
That's right.
Yep.
Well done.
Perfect. And BJCP beer judge. He's hosted a long-running podcast in the beer industry known as the Beer Temple's Insider Roundtable. So, you know, with that, he's also been named Industry Professional of the Year by the Chicago Tribune. So, with that, let's go ahead and crack up an old one, cold one, I should say, Christopher.
Yes, no old ones. We'll just crack cold ones. Thank you, Eric, for making me blush, I guess, a little bit with all those accolades. I'm not sure how you figured that out, but well done. I'm cracking open a beer. I'm starting with the Trumer Pils is what I have, but if any beer is calling out to any one of you folks out there, go grab it. I just think this Pilsner is kind of a nice sipper. We've got 6 beers. I'm going to taste through a few of them. We'll see how much time we have. I'll try to take a beer for every, you know, so often. That said, don't feel like you have to finish every beer before you move on to the next one. If you're enjoying what you're drinking, that's totally fine. I always like to mention I have a little cheat bucket, so it's, so don't feel like you're keeping up with me. But that said, got a little cheers for everyone, a little virtual cheers. There you are. Well done, Richard. And yeah, away we go. So as was mentioned earlier, feel free to unmute, ask any questions that you want, put them in the chat, and I will keep my eye on the chat as well, and I can answer those just throughout the program today. And I just do want to stress that I'm here for you guys, so ask any questions. If there's a question you had about beer, or even a question you had about whiskey or wine or anything like that, now's the time to ask. Go ahead. It doesn't need to be about the literal beer that we're tasting right now. So we will talk a little bit about what beer is, and then kind of maybe move through these different beers. I'll tell you a little bit about them, and talk a little bit about how. So let me ask you guys, there are 4 main ingredients in beer. There we go, there's some people. Does anybody know what any of the 4 primary ingredients in beer are? You can chat them, you can call them out. It can be a group effort.
Grain, hops.
Yeah. What? I heard hops, right?
Grain, hops.
Yes.
Water and
Yes.
yeast. Water and
Yeast.
yeast.
Yes. Barley. Oh, and then there you go. Roosevelt said, "Hey, Roosevelt, you look familiar. I think I've met you before." Yeah, you guys nailed it. So it is grain, hops, yeast, and water. Okay, and those are the 4 main ingredients. The way they roughly work together is water makes up the majority of what beer is. That's why it's a beverage. In fact, it's the most popular beverage the most popular alcoholic beverage in the world by volume, by far. Has been for a really long time. I think all other alcoholic beverages combined don't make up the amount of beer that is consumed by volume annually. So it's mostly water, but then you have yeast, which makes alcohol. That's how alcohol is made. Yeast takes sugar, converts it to ethanol. At the same time, it also puts out CO2. As I swirl my cup, you can see the bubbles. That's where the bubbles come from. The yeast makes the bubbles as well. It's a natural part of fermentation. So we've got the alcohol and the bubbles that are coming from the yeast, but the yeast need to have some fuel for that. That's the sugar, and that's where the grain comes in. That provides the sugar for the alcohol. So that's why beer is made with grain. And in fact, that's what kind of defines beer as beer, is that it's made with grain versus fruit or a vegetable or some other potential sugar source. Whenever a beverage starts from grain and is alcoholic, you've got a beer, as long as it's fermented. So then you have, all that's left is the hops, and that is kind of a way to add balance and complexity to the beer. I like to call it the spice of beer. Now you can spice beer with a lot of things, but that's the historical one for many reasons that we can get into. But the beer we're drinking right now is my personal favorite example of the beer that makes up 99% of all the beer brewed in the world, over 99% actually, which is light lager. When I say light, it looks kind of orange because of my Fox friend here. I'll see if he wants to give it a little sniff here. No, I'm doing it backwards. I have to act like a weatherman now. So, but on the you can see it's a light colored beer. That's what I'm talking about, not calories or anything like that. When I say light, I mean light in color. Light lagers like this Pilsner make up almost every single drop of beer made on the planet Earth. So I think it's a good place to start, a place of familiarity. I think that is one of the things that I personally like about beer. People don't have to feel uncomfortable about it. Everybody has had a beer before, and when you think of a beer, you probably think of something like this. So what we have here, as I mentioned before, is a Pilsner, which is a type of lager. Lagers and ales are the two types of beer, the two primary types of beer. All beer is an ale or a lager. And what makes it one or the other is the type of yeast that is used. Just like you have breeds of dogs, you have breeds of yeast. And you have lager yeast and ale yeast, okay? And within that, there's lots of subsections and stuff like that. So we've got this lager. It's nice and light and bright and hoppy. A subtype of lager is Pilsner. Pilsner is a type of lager. Again, by far the most popular type. There are other kinds, maybe or maybe not. You've heard of them before. Bock, Dunkel, stuff like that, Dortmunder, things like that are other types of lagers. Trumer is originally from the kind of the fatherland of lagers, that kind of Germanic region. This is technically from Austria, but I kind of group it the same. And the really cool thing about this beer in particular is, well, it's award-winning. It's won a World Beer Cup. They have World Beer Cups. You can judge in them and stuff. Multiple times for its Pilsner, and they were sending it over to the United States, and just like with everything nowadays, it was getting held up. There were supply chain issues. It was getting held up in port, sitting in these big container ships, just roasting in the sun, and they weren't happy with the quality of the beer by the time it arrived in the US. So what they decided to do, probably not what most people would have done, is they found a similar water source in the United States, in the kind of Berkeley, California area. They created a duplicate brewery, exactly the same as the one in Austria. They fly all the ingredients over from Austria, and they basically have two cloned breweries, one for North America and one for Europe. And I'm talking about a commitment to quality. I mean, it's a little, I mean, I'm glad they do it. Because I think the result is a very authentic European style Pilsner that tastes really fresh and isn't kind of maybe skunky or old or something like that, because we're not going to have old beer, as we mentioned before. We're going to have some nice fresh beer. So I hope you guys like it. I hope it's familiar, but maybe just a little bit more vibrant or a little bit more there than some of the Pilsners you've had in the past. And great beer to sip on while you listen to the next presenter. Back to you, Eric. Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Hey, thanks, Chris, for that. And thanks for ribbing me about my old beer kind of thing, right? Actually, next segment, I might have to go off camera, scoot off camera for a bit, because I cannot get my beer open. And I might have to get a pair of pliers. It's crazy. But anyway, again, hey, thanks. I see you guys are in the chat and starting to chat it up a little bit. That's perfect. If you have a specific question, again, you can come off mute. So let's talk about the data side of this for just a couple moments, right? You know, as in my role here at CyberRes, and I guess I didn't actually introduce myself terribly well, but essentially a cybersecurity strategist here at CyberRes. And when I talk to senior executives, a lot of time I ask them the question, do you know where your sensitive content is? And a lot of times they always, well, almost without exception, they say, of course we do, right? But they usually think about their CRM system, their billing system, their ERP system. They always think about their mission critical big bad system that's doing all the stuff for them. When I start asking questions about upstream applications, downstream applications, fringe marketing systems, closet IT organizations, they become a lot less confident in their answer. And so, you know, Jim, just kind of curious what your perspective is on, you know, clients that you've worked with and their awareness to the data.
So a lot of folks know, or as you mentioned, they're kind of familiar where the data is, right? When I look at, okay, yeah, sure, I've got my financial data, my books over in the finance package, and yeah, I've got my human information, the people about my employees and whatnot over in HR or HCM or whatever we call it. But and then file and data and IP is all on those places. The one thing I find that a lot of people don't really think about as much, and one of the things that we're most concerned with, is their identity data. So as I look at all of those attributes that I collect about people, and this becomes what we're talking about with privacy and CIAM, okay, who gets to share what attributes about me with them and their vendors? They don't even know where it is sometimes within their own organizations. So is the identity manager synchronizing those attributes out to other applications? And if so, what? Or manual processes doing that? Where do these attributes that I collect about people go? So that's one of the key problems, is that yes, they may be thinking about, or it's easier to get them to think about where their business specific sensitive data is, but the identity data sometimes is an afterthought and it starts a larger journey.
Yeah, fair enough. Hey, Jim, sorry, Richard, Matt, any really quick perspectives on that?
Yeah, no, that's exactly spot on. It doesn't matter. It's across industry, financial services, healthcare, higher education, all of these having that same challenge with data, how to manage, how to govern identity data within an organization, and who has access to it and what they're doing with it and how they got it and why they got it. So, yep.
Yeah. One of the key things that I see is that people start out and maybe they're global, like some of you. Maybe they're just trying to be good, conscientious people, shepherds of data, and they start thinking about, oh yeah, I need to implement these new controls. I need to give people the ability to control who has access to their data, and I need to give people the ability to click that forget me button, and I need to give the ability for people to control who I share that data with or how I use that data. Those are all the common things we think about. But if they don't know where that data is, that's all just blowing in the wind. You're putting up a nice front end that attaches to one system, but once you've shared out that data to other applications, how are you going about that? And if you don't know where that data is, that identity data shared to, how are you enforcing those controls? Because once you put that on and you put up that front page to give me the ability to control who sees my data as the consumer, you better be enforcing that all the way correctly in the background.
Yeah, absolutely.
Have you guys seen success stories in that area? Because that's one thing that we struggle with our customers. They want to throw up those tools on the front end, but they don't know where their data is and they don't know how to build these policies.
Yeah, again,
The other concern. Go ahead.
Go ahead, Richard.
I was just going to say that Jim brings up some good points, right? And one of the things that has changed with the data privacy laws that you're seeing coming down, in Europe, it's adopted en masse with GDPR, is we can no longer say that ignorance is bliss. So, claiming that you don't have a system for validating where your data is being used or where a customer's data is being used, you can't hide behind that with the privacy laws that are there. You will be at one point brought to task about what information you're sharing. A consumer can ask you what you're sharing about them. A privacy agency can ask you about it, and you will at one point have to provide some responsible proof of how that data is being used, how it's being distributed.
Cool. Yeah, I agree, Richard. And actually, Jim, I want to come back to the forget me button in a little bit here, but before we kind of go to our next tasting, if you will, just to kind of put some thoughts around this on my own is, what we've seen is a lot of, of course, now GDPR, CPRA, and all the other states that are starting to follow suit here. You know, what's happening in the market is actually now a lot on the enforcement side, right? And so the enforcement side is starting to get a lot of traction. I don't know if you guys caught it here, but I had a blog entry, shout out to my blog entry. But essentially, you know, I talked about the 1-year anniversary of CCPA and CPRA, and I think if I remember correctly, they highlighted, you know, 4 real strong cases of enforcement there. But they also linked out to a laundry list of other clients that they were doing on that as well. And so, you know, I think that's one thing that's, you know, interesting about this is, you know, when we first started down this GDPR journey back in the day, you know, people wondered how much teeth it would have with it, you know, and as far as enforcement is concerned. So, you know, that's just something to think about is it's only going to get worse. It's not going to get better, right? And so, you know, I think that's just kind of an important point is you have to know what you don't know at the end of the day, because to your point, you know, Matt and Richard and Jim, it's you can't, you know, claim ignorance anymore, unfortunately. But speaking of ignorance, I'm going to, you know, claim my own ignorance here because apparently I can't get my beer open. So I'm going to actually pop off camera for a minute, and I'm going to turn it back over to Chris for our next tasting.
All right. Good luck. Good luck with that, getting that beer open. I'm sure where there's a will, there's a way. So briefly, I was asked a question. Sorry, I'm getting a couple questions here. So someone asked how important water was. It's actually very important. I usually don't spend a lot of time on it, but nowadays we can kind of manipulate water. But historically, where you were brewing and the local water source dictated the types of beers you could and couldn't make. So for example, porter is from London and stout kind of is from London. And unless you had water like that London profile, you couldn't really make stout. Pale ale, further north in Burton in England, they couldn't make good stouts. They could only make these really nice pale ales. Those pale ales they couldn't make in London just because the water profile wasn't right for it. Oh, you got it. Well done, Eric. So nowadays, even to this day, even at the homebrew level, what people will do is kind of look up the local water table for different cities and reconstruct the water there depending on what style of beer you're going to brew. It's pretty amazing. So you can just look up, you know, even go to like a municipality website, see what kind of different mineral contents and in what quantity are prevalent in different brewing regions, and you can make a pale ale with Burton-on-Trent water. They call it Burtonizing your water. It's something that's done all the time. So I wasn't sure which direction. I still am not. I'm gonna make up my mind pretty much right now on the fly. I think I'm gonna go to a bit of a maltier beer right now. Examples of minerals someone's asking me about. So they will tend to be like gypsum or calcium carbonate. They call them salts. So it's just different minerals that are in everyone's drinking water to varying degrees. Some places in the world don't have hardly any minerals at all. It's almost like distilled water. The town of Pilsen in the Czech Republic is known for its incredibly soft water, and it makes really nice, bright lagers, and that is where Pilsner comes from. It was invented there by Pilsner Urquell. So it's kind of cool. That's the original inventor of the style Pilsner, about 1850 or something like that. Not that old, maybe even older, 1880. Not that old of a style. I was just doing a whole bunch of tastings for St. Patrick's Day, and Guinness is like almost like it's over 100 years older than the style of Pilsner. So people sometimes think that Pilsner's kind of been around forever. I have decided to go with a malty beer. This is the AleSmith Nut Brown Ale that I'm going to be opening up. I saw Jay was opening up the Unibu Branche de Chambly. I almost went with it, but I decided to kind of at the last second kind of call an audible. And thanks again for all of the questions that you guys are chatting me. I'll in the break time I'll take a look at it and try to get back to you individually. People are sending me private messages. Okay, so San Diego Brewery, AleSmith, pretty well-known brewing city, famous for West Coast IPAs. Anyone's ever heard of a West Coast IPA? San Diego is kind of like the birthplace of that style of beer. We used to call it the San Diego style IPA when I was younger. But AleSmith also makes probably, well, definitely one of, maybe my favorite brown ale in the entire country as well. And I wanted to bring this one up just because it looks so different from that last lager. Now we're dealing with ales. Everything now is going to be an ale versus a lager. And you can see very different, right? You can see why it's called a brown ale. If you hold it up to the light, you see it, it's actually kind of a reddish color. And you also may notice that it is, somebody's out there, it is clear, right? So a dark beer does not mean a murky beer. Dark beers can certainly be clean and clear. And I wanted to talk about where the color of the beer comes from and how malt can flavor and just affect a beer. So the color of the beer comes from the grain, the malt. Of those four ingredients, water, yeast, hops are not going to provide color. I certainly hope your water is not giving color to your beer. If you put other ingredients into your beer, yes, they may, if you put cherries in the beer, it might turn it a little bit pink. But of the main ingredients, the only one that colors it is the malt. And when I say malt and grain kind of interchangeably. Malt, when you hear the term malt, it refers to grain that has been toasted and germinated. That is the process of malting. So whenever you heard the term malt, that's what it means. It means barley or other grains that has been germinated and toasted. And when it's toasted, just like anything you toast, the more you toast it, the darker it gets, the more toasted colors it takes on. I like to use the analogy of a piece of toast. So as you turn up your toaster, your bread gets a little darker and you get more toasted flavors as well. So when you look at a beer, and those things are always going to be linked. If you have a beer that is this color, it is always going to have some of those flavors. There might be other flavors that are even bigger and overpower it. Doesn't mean it's the dominant flavor, but it's always going to be there. So when you see a beer this color, you know that it's going to have a nice roasted characteristic. Sometimes you can get them blackened and charred and you get burnt characteristics like coffee and stuff like that. In fact, the method that these grains are roasted are in essentially coffee roasting machines, the same machines that roast coffee beans. The person who invented the technique was a coffee roaster. So when you're drinking this beer, I want you guys and gals to think of something that is roasted and then see if you can pick up some of those flavors when you're tasting the beer. If anyone wants to put if they're brave enough to shout out or even put into chat any flavors that they're getting from the brown ale, that would be awesome. Great. But for me, oh yeah, Jay was talking how you like the Belgian. Yeah, I love Unibrow as well. I definitely get a little bit of that roasted coffee-like flavor, a little bit drying. That's actually from the hops. The hops are what kind of dry that beer out. And also notice, not really as heavy as some people assume a dark beer is. This beer's fairly low in alcohol, fairly easy to drink, and goes really well with food that's just a little bit more hearty than maybe a Pilsner can stand up to. So you can also start thinking about heavier foods with some more robust beers. So, oh, cheat sheet is on the nut brown can itself. I'll have to look at that. Hopefully I'm not like contradicting what is literally on the can. That would be bad. Let's look. What does the can say? A tribute to our okay. Cocoa, creamy mouthfeel. Yeah, if I had asked somebody for notes and they're like, I'm getting some cocoa and a creamy mouthfeel. It's really a sessionable classic if you ask me. I probably would have figured something out, but yeah, 5% alcohol, same as a Budweiser essentially for alcohol. And you know, is it as light as a Budweiser? No, but it's not very heavy and it's got a whole ton of flavor in there. So it's nice to switch it up every once in a while. All right, I think it's all you now, Eric.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Chris. Appreciate that. Yeah, I'm a favor of the dark ambers and brown ales as well. So let's so when we talked about data privacy, and let's just say we're confident where we know where our sensitive content is now, right? So Matt, I kind of want to ask you, looking at data privacy and looking at identity management and trying to perform this frictionless customer experience out there, and of course the ever growing demand or not demand, but ever number of identities that are out there, right? I think even I think it's Volkswagen has an identity for every single vehicle coming off its line, right? So where's this mashup going at the end of the day? What are you seeing out there?
Yeah, no, great question. So when you look at it from a consumer side and you look at it from like the internal organization side, you can answer that question a little bit differently. But let's focus on the consumer side for a second. So everything about what we do has some sort of identity with it. If you've heard about Web 3.0 and this new construct of the web and where it's going with blockchain and those types of things, this identity becomes more decentralized than what we are accustomed to with today's world, where we work with organizations and companies where we enter our information, in some cases freely, not knowing what they're doing with our data. But as everything that we interact with, everything that we deal with, Internet of Things, all these things have this concept of an identity with it. So how do you manage? How are these organizations managing this large, complex, influx of all this volume of data? It's not new. It's not a new problem. It's been going on, but it just gets bigger and bigger the more we go down this path of managing identities and protecting the data, right? There has to be this intersection or this interconnectedness with data security, data privacy, data protection, along with identity and access management and governing that, right? So there's got to be that intersection, and the way we see it, the way we visualize it, is through this construct of purpose, or this concept, I should say, of purpose. So you have somebody who's using the data for its lawful, legitimate, intended, ethical purpose or use of it. They would set that as they are the owner of that data, so they are using it for their purposes because it's their data. But when you talk about an organization, back to the other side of that coin, is the organization has to prove to auditors, regulators, those types of people that this systems analyst or this data scientist has a lawful, legitimate purpose for using that data. So how do you pull that together? Well, we build it into this concept of purpose-based access control. Think of it like role-based access control, but the concept of purpose-based access control says that you have a lawful, legitimate purpose, but that purpose definition, that purpose statement, is built into a policy that's being managed by identity governance platform, and that governance platform ties that policy with that entitlement. We've been doing it for years. A lot of you guys have been working in identity for years. You know that we know who you are, where you came from, how you got access, even geolocation, sensitive kind of stuff to help with behavioral analytics and those types of things. But the piece that's been missing for years in all of these is that why component. When you think about identity governance and doing certifications and access controls and attestations to who is accessing what applications or what data, it's been a rubber stamp for years. The manager says, yep, my employee is supposed to have access to this application or this data to do his job. Well, what's the purpose of it? To do his job is not the purpose. It has to have a purpose. So you take this concept back to the business, who is the data stewards or the data owners of this data, and work with them to build these policies around purpose definitions that then can be enforced by entitlements management, the same concept that we all have known and loved today with identity governance. But the growing need for doing this more and more is even becoming more and more prevalent with all of these identities coming into play.
So Matt, I got a quick follow-up on that if I can. Sorry, Eric, I keep jumping on you, but
I know, right? I didn't hit the buzzer fast enough.
yeah. Well, it's like a bar, man. It's whoever gets in first gets the rest. That's the question. So Matt, I mean that kind of inspires me to two follow-on questions on. You mentioned Volkswagen. So is there a shared purpose kind of zone that we have to be aware of? Okay, Volkswagen has an identity for their Volkswagen that they sold me. And let's say I bought it, but it's got a maintenance contract. And so they're gathering data. There's attributes, there's data. Yeah, I can see that GPS location of the car is my data because I'm driving it around. So it's really location of me. But it's also location to the car, but also all of the sensors that are going on in the engine, whether they're cheating on my gas mileage or not. All of that stuff is how they maintain my car. So when the gas pedal's at 80% all of the time and my speed is excessive of the location, is that information they need or don't need? Is there this new shared purpose concept coming? And then second, does this mean that you mentioned, yeah, we can't to do my job in the world of microservices? For me to do one little web page that renders four attributes or four elements of data, I'm going to have 40 or 50 microservices behind the scene doing their jobs.
Yep.
And each microservice is going to have an account, an identity, and I'm going to have to grant and revoke access based upon those, maybe dynamically or just as doing their job. Is the visualization of this going to just blow out of control? I'm going to have not just my manager or my employer can see these customers, but 40 or 50 microservices for every little thing I want to do.
Yep. No, don't think of it like you have to have hundreds of these purpose definitions. It's not like thousands of roles that have to be developed, right? It's a concept that says marketing needs this identity data about Jim Gherkin. Marketing might need Jim Gherkin's name, but they may not need his email address. They may not need his phone number. They may not need his home address. These elements, these attributes about your identity can be derived by those data stewards who own that data that say, this is how it's policed, or this is how it's policy managed, right? So same with the car thing. If you accelerate on the gas pedal and it tells Volkswagen that, and I hate to be picking on Volkswagen like this, but if you accelerate on the accelerator as the driver of the car, does Volkswagen know it's you as the driver, or is it somebody else? How's the identity tied to that gas pedal and running the car past its oil service change or whatever? These are attributes that are, is there a need to know? Is there a purpose behind having that data? That's what has to be determined as part of this exercise to enforce this purpose definition, if you will.
Yeah, and so to summarize, Matt, I can see this even going as far as, in my world today, if I have access to, like, just say an ERP system, and that means I have access to somebody's social security number, all day long. But if we introduce purpose, then based on that purpose, I may get back the full social security number, maybe a partial social security number, or no social security number. Again, need to know and purpose of my access. Is that a fair statement?
That's a fair statement. Yep.
Yeah. All right. Cool. Well, with that, let's go back over to Christopher for our next tasting.
All right.
I wanted to add one more thing. There was a question in the chat about discovering data. I don't know if somebody saw that, but I think it's an important distinction to make. The first part of it, I wouldn't say the first step. I would say the parallel first step, because there's a part of this building this purpose definition and getting people educated on that. But I would say discovering that data, and we talked about at the very beginning, knowing where it's at and what kind of data it is. This is a key component to that, and a lot of large organizations have, you know, millions of these different disparate repositories of where all this data is at everywhere, whether it's structured or unstructured data. But understanding where it's at and identifying it, and making sure that you know what kind of data it is, whether it's credit card data or personal identifiable information or it's healthcare information, you know, all these things have to be determined and identified as such that then can feed into this policy decisioning mechanism that I'm talking about with this purpose. Because let's face it, at the end of the day, what's the point of privacy or even PII if the identity component is not connected to it, right? There has to be that coexistence of understanding what's the information, what's in the information, how does it need to be protected, whether it needs to be masked or obfuscated or tokenized, you know, with all of that great technology that's used to protect it. But if you don't understand what's in it and how it got derived to be that way, it makes it more and more difficult for organizations to manage that data. I'll just leave it at that. Hope that answered that question.
Yeah, perfect. Thanks, Matt. Cool. Okay, Christopher, now back over to you.
Okay. The beer I've got now is the Surly Controlled Chaos IPA. Yep, that one. That's right. Jay is modeling for us very nicely. Yes, perfect. Well done. And it is, as the name suggests, an IPA. IPAs are hoppy beers. Whenever you see pale ale, that's what IPA stands for, India Pale Ale. Expect something to be hoppy. And when I say hoppy, I mean that is characteristic of hops. What are hops? Hops are a little green, well, it's to me they look like a miniature pine cone if pine cones were made out of like vegetal material rather than like a woody material. And they're loaded with all these really flavorful oils. And when you steep the hops, the oils come out and they flavor the beer. And I always say that they flavor the beer in kind of two ways, two categories, very broadly speaking, green and fruity. When I say green, I mean herbal, grassy, woody, piney, stuff like that. Fruity tends to be citrus, grapefruit, but it can also be tropical and kind of berries and stuff like that. But most often, the classic, especially US hop profile, because hops, just like grapes, you have varietals, and also where they're grown can affect how they taste. So US hops tend to be pine and grapefruit. So for this beer, the Controlled Chaos, see if you can pick up anything that you would think is associated with that hoppy flavor. And if you want to type it in there, okay, so many different types of IPAs. Yeah, okay, so Roosevelt's asking, why are there so many different types of IPAs? West Coast, hazy, New England, et cetera, et cetera. Let me talk about the other thing that hops do, and then I'll get to why there's so many types of IPAs. So the hops do something completely different than what how those oils flavor the beer. They also, if you treat them a little bit differently, you don't steep them, but you actually boil them. Give it like a hard boil. They have acids that become water soluble and bitter the beer. And bitterness acts very interesting with our perception of sweetness. It more or less masks our perception of sweetness and kind of vice versa. They cancel each other out is a better way to put it, to some degree. And it essentially is a way to add complexity and dryness to a sweet beverage. Anytime you have fermentation, you need sugar. That's the fuel to make alcohol. You need something to kind of balance that sugar out. Wine and cider will use acidity very often. Everyone knows that sweet and sour is really good. And what beer does is they use bitterness. And we taste sweet things more easily. We'll taste that first, and then the bitterness will slowly start to kind of cancel out some or all of our perception of the sweetness. Depending on how much bitterness, that's how much drying characteristic you will get. If anyone was drinking this beer and you noticed it started out kind of maybe a little nutty, chocolatey, and then dried out over the course of 30 seconds. That was our perception of the bitterness balancing out or canceling out our perception of the sweetness. And it's important to remember as you're drinking this beer, this one's not equal. This one's more bitter, so it's going to get fairly bitter fairly quick. But starts out a little fruity. You get that kind of tingle from the carbonation, and then already your mouth's starting to dry. And in 20 more seconds, my mouth's going to be completely dry. And it's just interesting to note that the beer isn't literally less sweet. It's just our perception. It hasn't literally become more bitter. It's how the sweetness and the bitterness, you know, spoonful of sugar really does help the medicine go down. And it's just how our perception of these things work. Now, the reason that there's so many types of IPAs, if you want like the real like industry insider baseball reason why, because if you put IPA on a label, it sells. Bang, it's gone, it's sold. That's why pale ales don't exist. They're like session IPAs or whatever IPA now, black IPA. You just put IPA on a beer and it sells. That's kind of the short answer. But that said, there have always been kind of different types of like some wiggle room within the definition of what an IPA is. There's kind of English style, there's American style, and then you started to get this really hoppy version, and it was just called, you know, that's how they made them on the West Coast, you know. And then on the East Coast, they were kind of more malty back in the 90s. And then in New England, they started making these hazy ones that were incredibly, they were focused entirely on those oils I was talking about, and they dropped the bitterness down significantly. There, Patrick's got one. There's a hazy. And one of the kind of hallmarks of hazies is they are less bitter. They don't really rely on the bittering aspect of hops. So because of what I just said about how bitterness relates to how we perceive things, hazy IPAs are going to taste a little sweeter, right? So they're going to be sweeter because there's less bitterness to them. Some more than others, but that's just kind of a general trend. So if you don't like the bitterness in IPA in beer, but you do like that hop flavor, check out anything that says New England or hazy or juicy. They're all kind of synonyms for the same style, more or less, of IPA, which is going to be very, very accentuated by the hop flavor and just a little bit more restrained, sometimes bordering even on sweet from the bitterness. So, but that's a great question. And now there's even more sub styles, but West Coast and hazy are the two big ones right now.
Perfect. Thanks, Chris. All right, so we're kind of in the final throes here a little bit, and so I'm going to ask a quick question of Jim, if you can answer it in like 2 minutes or less, and then I want Matt to, I'm going to pose a question from a previous discussion to Matt. So Jim, you know, given your kind of more on, you know, making things happen side of the house, you know, what are really kind of the top 2 or 3 challenges you see in kind of bringing these disciplines together, and you know, how can you mitigate them? I know that's a lot to ask in 1 or 2 minutes or less. You're on mute, sir.
Yep, I was over in the quiet part of the bar. So one of the bigger problems that I see is really, we've got the tools, we've done a lot of this. Now we have to think kind of like Matt was saying, it's purpose built. We have to get the business side of the information together. If I'm doing an IDP where I can log in using Google credentials, yeah, what does that mean to me as the technologist? Not much, but I have to somehow take and understand their policy and inherit and adopt that in my own policy and transfer that on to the customer. So there's got to be a better understanding of all of this stuff from a privacy perspective about what that privacy means to the data, but also where is the data? Those are my 2 big problems.
Okay, fair enough. And Matt, just we need to leave a few minutes here to wrap up, but if you can, in a couple minutes, we in a previous conversation here recently talked about kind of a financial customer that you had worked with and some of their challenges and how they were addressing them.
Yeah, so that it's not an unusual problem statement, and it probably fits a lot of use cases with the audience here as well. I would be surprised if people on this call said they don't have this problem. But this financial services customer of ours, they have multiple lines of business, and each of those lines of business curate their own consumer identities from the customer, their customer identities through each one of these business units. And due to regulatory requirements and internal policies that they've mandated themselves, they're not allowed to share this collected personal identifiable information amongst the different lines of business. But yet they curate all this information from each of these different lines of business and put it into a master data management system, a know your customer database, if you know what I mean. And while all that data is in a single repository, if you will, for customer identity, it's customer data, the different lines of business, they're not allowed to have access to it because of these regulations or policies that they have in place internally, and there are manual policies in place today. So we're helping them automate those policies. But the key to that is, of course, going to each one of these different lines of business and understanding that data from the business side. What is the business using this data for, and why do they need the other pieces of data from the other lines of business? Like I was talking about earlier with, they may need Jim's first name and his last name, but they don't need his home address. They may need his email address, but there is a business purpose for what they need that information for, and they built that into the tool to be able to do this for them automatically. So this is a pretty unique opportunity for us to be able to do that for a large financial services organization. But it's working well so far, and happy to ask more questions about it. As a matter of fact, you can read the recent white paper that I wrote, helped write on this subject that's hosted on the new Micro Focus CyberRes CIAM website. So we can get you links to that as well.
All right, perfect. Hey, thank you, Matt. Thank you, Jim. Thank you, Richard. I appreciate your guys' expertise today on this topic. Obviously, a very deep and broad topic to talk about in, let's call it 30 minutes or less total. I'd also like to thank Christopher for your knowledge and willingness to share. Definitely learned a few things for myself today, so I do appreciate that. I am going to drop the link. So Matt just referenced our CyberRes website. I'm going to drop that in the chat box as well for you guys. Also, look for an email tomorrow about more information, and that will be sent to you from both Novacoast and CyberRes, and also as part of that, we sent a recording. But kind of the last parting thought from myself is, one of the challenges I think I see in the market space in general is, obviously you got to know what you don't know, and obviously you got to power identity. You have to, be able to enforce policy. You have to be able to manage content. The forget me button, that's a favorite topic of mine, because many of you know that's not as easy as the courts thought it would be, or whoever the regulators thought it would be. Yeah, let's take all of Eric's information, both structured and unstructured, let's press a button and it magically disappears, irregardless of all the other regulations that are out there regarding keeping that type of data and so on. And so how do you navigate those waters? And so that's the big disconnect I see a lot of times, is you have stuff on how to find and manage and tag data, and then actually taking meaningful action on that data, whether you're powering identity, whether you're powering managing that information, disposal of that information, and those type of topics. So anyway, that's kind of Eric's parting thought for today. I appreciate each and every one of you guys spending time with us this afternoon, and certainly enjoying a few beers. I wish we had time to shotgun one more. I don't know, Chris, can we do one in 1 minute or less?
What I'll do is I'll give just a very brief. I'll give some cliff notes. Okay, this one first. This one is really an example of how yeast can flavor a beer. The driving factor on this is yeast. You'll notice that it is some coriander and some orange peel, but the majority of the flavor in this is coming from yeast. Certain types of yeast also can make a lot of flavors in addition to alcohol and bubbles. So that's what this one's about. These two, really, really cool beers. This is Allagash's North Sky. It's just a really well put together stout. It's not going to be that big overpowering stout. It's going to be so balanced and subtle for a 7.5% stout. Uses a little bit of Belgian yeast, so it uses some of that flavorful yeast in a stout. Very cool. And then last but not least, one of my favorite beers that there is, Jungle Boogie out of Chicago. No fruit in this beer. When you taste this beer, remember it. There is no fruit in it. They're evoking these peachy flavors, like gummy peach flavors from a use of tea, which is very abnormal in brewing, and a flavorful fruity hop called Mosaic. And when you put them together, they like exploded with this fruity character. And I just always think it's really cool when they can create flavors without literally just putting in some like peach extract in it, because it tastes like there's peach in the beer. But it's dry too, so it's like this dry, ripe peach flavor. Very cool beer. Okay, that's it.
Awesome. Hey, thank you, Chris, again. Appreciate everybody, and we're going to close out today, and let's give it up for Chris. All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you. Very nice.